or else he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't serve both God and mammon. And mammon, the term that he's using here, is referring to wealth or the love of wealth in this life. And that's what that word means. Now skipping over to chapter 7, verses 13 through 27, Jesus says there, "Enter in by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many are those who enter in by it. How narrow is the gate, and restricted is the way that leads to life. Few are those who find it. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravening wolves. By their fruits you will know them. Do you gather grapes from thorns or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree produces good fruit, but the corrupt tree produces evil fruit. A good tree cannot produce evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree produce good fruit. Every tree that doesn't grow good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them. Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will tell me in that day, 'Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name? In your name cast out demons, and in your name do many mighty works?' And then I will tell them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who work iniquity.' Everyone, therefore, who hears these words of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain came down, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it didn't fall, for it was founded upon the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." Now, I know that many times over the past 2 years, I think we're just about a month shy of me being here for 2 years, and many times over the past 2 years, I've been somewhat repetitive when it comes to a certain topic. And the topic is authentic Christian living. I tend to come back to it quite a lot. Now, I talk about different things and different topics. Last week, I talked about, keeping faith when we're going through different storms. The week prior to that was about loving our enemies. I've talked about baptism. I've talked about all of these different things and doctrines that are in the Bible. But everything all comes back to one thing. And I choose to be repetitive most of the time because Christ was repetitive most of the time. God was repetitive all throughout the Bible. There is really only one message from the prophets, Elijah, John the Baptist, all the way into the New Testament. There's one message, even to Christ himself. In fact, Jesus says something very interesting about this. In Matthew chapter 11, verse 17, he's referring to how John the Baptist came with the same message that he did, but they kind of both approached it differently. And he says, "We played the flute for you, and you didn't dance. We mourned for you, and you didn't lament." In other words, what Christ is saying there is we came with all sorts of different approaches. A happy approach, a sad approach, a mad approach, a loving approach, but the message was the same. And it didn't matter how we approached you, you rejected it. And the reason why you rejected it was because it was the message itself you didn't want to hear. It wasn't how we were approaching it. And to prove that, that's why we did it all these different ways. It actually, this morning, something happened at my house that kind of reminded me of this with Josiah. So, Josiah, we have to speak about being repetitive. We've got to be super repetitive with that boy because he just does not... Sometimes I just don't think he's listening. But many times if it's something he doesn't want to do, he's certainly not going to listen to it. And so, this morning, he comes down the stairs and he's all upset because Mommy had told him to go find his shoes. And so he comes over to me and he says, "Mommy told me to have you come help me find my shoes." And I said, "Okay, let's go find your shoes." So we go into the den where we keep the shoes, and there's a little bench in there, and it's got two sides in it. And so I opened it up, and he's standing there watching while I'm doing all the work, of course. And I'm pulling out all the shoes on one side. It's not in there. I put it back. Pull out all the shoes on the other side. It's not in there. So I put it all back on both sides. And then I go upstairs to find Shelley after doing all this. And I said, he said that you wanted me to help him find his shoes. I said, but we've been all through the den and can't find his shoes. And she said, well, when I told him that, I said they're in the living room. So he knew that the whole time, but yet he walked with me back to the den and stood there. Because, in other words, he didn't want to listen to it because it was a message he didn't really care for. Because it wasn't a message of go play. It was a message of go do something that you don't want to do. And so he didn't hear it. And so this is why you have to be repetitive with children. This is why God is extremely repetitive all through the Bible. All right, even Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount that we've been studying now and we've been studying specifically the Sermon on the Mount for probably a month, maybe even 2 now. I'm not quite really sure, but Jesus gave many different instructions during his Sermon on the Mount. Many different things that he said. As I just said last week, I talked about faith the week, not being anxious the week prior to that. It was about loving your enemies. But when you get down to the heart of the matter, all of these things that he taught about collectively boil down to one topic. They all trace back to the same thing, and that is having boundaries. Now, we live in a world that was created for boundaries, but yet since the Garden of Eden we've rejected them. We all know the story. Adam and Eve were given a great amount of freedom. They were just given one boundary, one thing that they were not supposed to do. But man chose to step on the outside of those boundaries. And even to this day, we still continue to do it. We do it on a much more extreme level now. No one believes in boundaries anymore. In fact, you're scoffed at if you say you believe in boundaries. Every day I see post after post after post after post on social media celebrating living without any boundaries, having our own individuality and superiority from each other, and encouraging us, usually, to question all authority and all boundaries in our life and to not have any. The very theme of this world is selfishness and doing things on our own. Now, there was a popular slogan for the abortion movement back in the 1970s that said, "My body, my choice." And it kind of embodies what I'm talking about. It's my life. It's my choice. This is what I'm going to decide to do. And it's coming back again today. I just saw Gucci is making it, or they're printing it on some of their items and trying to get this back because of everything that's going on in the world right now. And so, it really just goes to show us how selfish we truly are. We don't think about anyone else. We don't think about anything else. We only think about ourselves. And even in advertising, in the slogans they give us, we're told to do things like think outside of the box, to have it your way. One of them is because I'm worth it. We're told, a few years ago, the military had one that was entitled An Army of One. It's all about ourselves and about individuality and never about boundaries and never about respecting other people. But never are we told to consider others or to help others shoot for the moon and maybe put ourselves to the side once in a while we try and help someone else succeed. We're never told that. We're only told to look at ourselves. You see, there is a narcissistic and selfish bent to our human nature that only thinks of our own well-being. And it's that very attitude that's what hurts others. It's what causes pain. It's what causes war. It's what causes all different things that are going on in this world. Now, this past week, I had an interesting thing happen, and I feel like the Lord used it to kind of give me an analogy for this message. And that was I went to Valvoline to get an oil change. Now, we haven't had an oil change on that Chevy Traverse since we bought it. This was the very first one. It was finally time for it to get one. I didn't know a whole lot about the car. I didn't really study it before I got it. And so we go to Valvoline just because it was, usually we don't, but I went this time because we were in a hurry and we had all 6 kids with us and we didn't really want to get out anywhere and we just wanted to get this done and over with because Shelley had to take the car and drive a few hours to go to a funeral with her mom the following day. So we go into Valvoline, which I know is typically a little more expensive, but I was kind of prepared for that. And we go in and there was this nice man that was working there and his name was Joel. And immediately, when I saw this man, I kind of felt like the Lord was telling me something. It was almost like He was drawing me a little bit to Him. So I was just kind of chatting with this guy, asking him a little bit of things, and he's just a really nice man, but I could kind of tell that he was a little bit exhausted, and he seemed a little bit down. And so, anyways, as we're going on, he's looking at different things, and then he tells me, I said, I just want the basic oil change, the cheapest thing you got. And he looks everything over, and he looks at me, and he says, well, the oil change is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of, it was $80-some. And immediately inside of me, I'm like, $80-some for an oil change? This is absolutely ridiculous. I remember when you could go get an oil change for around $15. And I was very upset about this. And one of the reasons why it was $80 was because you got to put a special oil in this Traverse according to the owner's manual, and you're not supposed to just put regular oil in there. And plus, again, as I said, it was at Valvoline, so it's more expensive. And inside, I was like thinking to myself, I should just leave right now and tell them I'm not going to do this and go somewhere else and pay something cheaper. But the Lord told me not to do that. In fact, He told me to calm down a little bit and to continue to talk to this man. So I didn't get upset with him. I said okay. And so we continued to talk, and I asked him how long he had worked there, and he said he had worked once before at Valvoline, and he had come back. And so then we started talking about what it was like to be in a business where you work with the public and how people can be hard to get along with. And then he started telling me a story of a guy who came in who had a vehicle like mine who was supposed to have a special oil change. And when they told him how much it was going to be, this guy flipped out and started saying, absolutely not, I refuse. And he even made the guy look it up in the owner's manual while they were sitting there. He even called the dealership because it was his first oil change. He was so angry at the dealer, he just blew up and threw this big fit. And this man Joel, who I was talking to, started telling me how stressful these situations can be when people act like that. And then as we got to the end, he told me, he said, really, he said, out of all the customers that come in here, he said, 80% of them are just okay. He said, they don't cause any problems, but they're not super nice. He said, 10% cause me all sorts of problems and stress my day out and sometimes ruin it. But then he said, the other 10% are above that 80%. And he said, I would throw you in that 10%. And he said, you really made my day. I really appreciated talking to you. And then we started talking about the Lord. And how it got to there was, his name was Joel. I asked him if it was biblical or not. And we started talking about his mother and different things. And it opened up these conversations where I could share my faith. And we got to talk about it for a while. But none of that would have happened if I had just gotten angry, if I hadn't listened to the Lord, and if I had just wrote this guy off and said, you're lying to me, I don't want this $80 oil change, I'm just leaving and I'm getting out of here. But I chose to go against my very nature, what I wanted to do, and sit there. And because of that, it gave me an opportunity to speak to this man about the Lord and to obviously give him a good experience for the day. Now, a seed was planted in him because I chose to do that. And because I chose to produce good fruit instead of something that maybe he would consider as poison or as vicious that he experienced with some of these other people that he told me about. And as Christians, many times we don't understand the importance of our faith. When we become a Christian, we don't understand that we're willingly surrendering ourselves to Jesus Christ, and we're accepting boundaries. We're accepting boundaries. We're not lowering boundaries or lowering standards. We're saying we're welcoming these things into our lives. We've actually given up a few rights because Christ tells us we can't act a certain way anymore. That He's expecting something out of us. And what He's expecting is love. You can no longer serve that other master. That's why I started with that first verse where Jesus said, no man can serve two masters. You can only serve one. Now the best analogy that I know how to give to that in this life is, you all know that I work here for the church and I preach every Sunday, and I also work for the library. All right, so technically, in that way of speaking, I have two masters. Now, what Jesus said was, you're either going to love one and hate the other, or you're going to follow one and not follow the other. And it's very, very true. Because as you all know, we've had things going on at the library where I felt like I'm actually going to need to leave the job because it's conflicting. So in other words, I have to look at these two jobs and say, which one is my master? Which one am I going to choose to follow? And the other one is going to have to submit. So in other words, I may have to leave that other one. This is why Jesus said you can't serve two masters. You can't say you're following Him and still behave in another way. Now this scares us. And it scares us because we live in a society that whines and moans every single day about our own individual rights. We've got the ACLU. On the other side, we've got the ACLJ, always fighting each other about rights that they're losing. We've got the Southern Poverty Law Center. We've got all these different individual groups, and they're all fighting, saying, you guys are trying to trample on my rights. We don't understand the utter necessity, sometimes as Christians, of bearing good fruit ourselves at all times, even when it goes against what we might think are our rights that are being trampled on. Not just when we're in a good mood, but especially Christ expects it from us, especially when we don't feel like it. Now, God put me to the test after writing this sermon. I wrote this sermon, as you know, I haven't had a whole lot of time lately with things that are going on in my life, and I had to put this together Saturday morning while I was at work. And here I am writing this outline out. I thought, well, I've got this wonderful analogy with this man Joel that I spoke with, and everything was going fine. And then I get done with this sermon, and then I think every customer that walked in the door just wanted to be as rude as they possibly could. And I thought to myself, you're testing me to make sure that I'm really going to do what I'm going to preach about on Sunday. And I'm going to tell you the truth, that this week there have been times where I failed. All right, I'm not standing up here trying to say I'm better than everyone else and that I've got it all figured out, and that every time I'm going to do the right thing. I pray that the closer I get to the Lord, the more I will do things that direction. But there are times where even I have said, or I've not realized what I'm doing, and then the Lord reminds me of it later. And those are the times where we just need to repent, and we need to move on, and we need to use them as examples. But in all things, we have to remember that even when we are being put to the test, even when things are not going that way, that's especially when God is expecting these things out of us. Christ said every tree that doesn't grow good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Now think about what that actually means. I'll read it again. He says, every tree that doesn't grow good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. That is a very powerful statement from the Lord, something that as Christians we should be very worried about. And we need to ask ourselves, is when as Christians are we going to comprehend that our primary purpose in this life as a Christian is the Great Commission. That's what Christ has told us our primary purpose as a church is. And the primary purpose of the Great Commission is revealing to the world the good news of Jesus Christ. But the world is not going to accept that good news if it's wrapped up in the form of a rotting and molding apple or a bad piece of fruit. Something that they're going to look at and they're going to turn their nose up to. And that's what we're producing off of our tree. This is why Jesus says it's so important for us to be producing fruits that are nutritious for the world. Something that will make them desire to come to Christ, to give up their way of life. But this is very hard to do. Again, because it all has to do with our human nature and how we are inside. Just think about how we respond to things. The next time some teenager at McDonald's that doesn't really care much for their job messes up your food or gives you your Big Mac and fries cold, and then you choose to rip them up one side and down the other for what they've done or how they've overcharged you or different things that have happened. I mean, do you really think as you're doing this, as you're yelling at them, that they are going to end up taking spiritual advice from you later? I mean, the likes of you, someone that's treating them disrespectfully, even if they deserve it, are they really going to look at you and see Jesus Christ? No, absolutely not. They would probably never listen to you again. When you talk nasty, maybe to the telemarketer that's on the phone that's interrupting your day, how are you going to witness to them for Christ or say God bless you as you get off the phone. You're going to look like the world's biggest hypocrite, and we don't understand these things. When we were maybe mean to the gas station attendant, because first of all, we view them as beneath us in the first place, because they're working at a gas station, and we think that that's just this lowly job, and they don't want to get a real job, and then we take all of our frustrations out on them like it was personally their decision to hike the gas prices up, and we're just as nasty as we can be to them. How are we fulfilling the Great Commission when we're behaving that way, just because we feel like our rights are being trampled because we're paying a little more at the pump, when it wasn't their fault in the first place? I've told you all before, when I was a teenager, I worked at the Sunoco station in Johnstown, and I'll never forget this one day. My boss actually did this to be nice. It was when gas prices were first really going up extremely high, up in the neighborhood of $4, and everybody was all upset about what was going on with these gas prices all over the nation. And the gas station across the street, which I think was a Citgo at the time, they raised their prices, and it was a substantial amount. It was like 25 cents or more. And we hadn't got our gas in for the day. We just had a little bit left. And my boss, Sean Stennard, he said, you know what? He said, I'm not going to raise it until we get that in. For the rest of the time that we have this gas, we're just going to keep it at a lower price for the town. He actually was doing it to be nice. So he leaves it down. Of course, everybody's coming to us, because across the street it's a quarter or more for a gallon. And since everybody was coming to us, we ran out of gas faster. So I had to go out once we ran out and put little plastic baggies on the pumps to make sure that no one or people would know when they pulled up that we were out of gas. Maybe put a little sign. I don't remember if I said out of gas or something like that. And this woman walked into the gas station because she saw the sign. She pulled up, saw the plastic bag, and she thought that we did it intentionally just to draw people over to us. And even though we didn't really have gas, when actually what we were doing was trying to help people out. And she came in and looked at me, a 17-year-old boy that has no control over OPEC or gas prices or anything of that nature, and she just let me have it. I mean, she was as nasty as she could possibly be. She yelled at me for probably 5 minutes and then got back in her car. And I turned to my boss and I said, from now on, I'm just going to start laughing wickedly like I'm really getting all the money from these gas prices when these people start yelling at me. But see, our behavior matters as Christians. And that is what Christ was trying to get at. That's what God was trying to get across to the Jews all the way through the Old Testament. That's why He is so repetitive, because we're like Josiah was this morning. It's something we don't want to hear. We don't want to behave a certain way. We want to behave the way that we want to behave. So we just tend to ignore the things that we don't really want to pay attention to. And this is why God comes across. It's why He said, like I started at the beginning of this sermon, He comes across and He gives this message across in different ways. He'll come across angry. He'll come across loving. He's trying to get the message across to us in a way that we will understand. Now, some of Shelley and I's silliest arguments, I think, have been over the fact that she doesn't like how I take the scenic route many times when I'm driving. So we'll be out and about and we'll be going somewhere, and it's usually, I don't do this if we're in a hurry. It's just if we got nothing else going on for the day. She'll expect that I should take the main road when I like to take a back road. And the reason why I do this is because I appreciate the back roads more than she does. So I like looking at the barns. I like looking at the farms. I like looking at these things that you won't see if you get on the main road. And if I've got time to do it, I'm going to go ahead and do it. I used to frustrate Dad all the time when I did this. When I was a teenager and I got my learner's permit, I would beg him to let me drive, and we would be out driving, and we'd be right there at Black Snake Road where we lived, but I'd drive out of town and then come out one of those back roads and then come back around to the house, and Dad would just be sitting over there quiet, and then we'd pull in the driveway and he would say something like, "You sure like to go around the barn to get to the house." Is I don't understand why you're doing this. And Shelley does the same thing. She gets upset. But you know, the reason when I do it, it really irritates people, as I said. And the reason is because the human nature is we want to get where we're going, and we want to get what we want, and we want to do it as fast as possible. And this is why we have major highways all over the world. That's why we have the interstate system. I think Eisenhower put it in the 50s to try and get the military across the country as quick as possible in case there was ever a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So it's in our nature to do these things. Now, taking this back to what Christ said and what I read, when he talked about the two different roads, he said that we can't be that way. We can't be impatient in our faith. He said, wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many are those who enter in by it. How narrow is the gate, and restricted is the way that leads to life. Few are those who find it. And few, because we're all wanting to get on that main road. So spiritually speaking, if we're on that spiritual highway, headed on the easy and broad way of selfishness and narcissism with the rest of this world, and our vines are producing thorns and thistles just as theirs are, then it doesn't matter how many times we come and sit in these pews. It doesn't matter how many times we would shout hallelujah or get up and run and dance. Christ himself has said that no matter what, it doesn't matter if we call him our Lord, that if we're behaving that way, he said we're heading towards our own destruction. I go back now to the beginning of this sermon and how I was talking about the repetitive nature of God and the reason for that repetitiveness. And again, as I said, God is repetitive because the human race is extremely hard-headed. We will not let the message sink into our ears. If it is something that we don't like, no matter how clear God comes across, we're going to refuse to listen. We're going to play in ignorance like a child. We're only going to hear what we want to hear. And again, that's why I gave the example of Jesus saying, we played the flute for you. In other words, we came happy, but you didn't dance to what we said. We mourned for you, and you didn't lament. You just sat there with stone-cold faces because you didn't want to change. So Christ knew how difficult it is. He knows how difficult it is for us to hear what we don't want to hear. And this is why in his Sermon on the Mount, he uses all sorts of different analogies. Just in what we read today, he asks, what road are you on? He wants to know what kind of fruit you're producing to this world. He tells you that you can only have one master and that you have to make a choice. But all of those things, everything that he talked about, all comes back to one point. And it comes back to sincerity and authenticity in the faith and obeying the boundaries that God has set up for us. So as we leave this place today, let us ask ourselves this one question. Do I have boundaries? Maybe that's the biggest question you could ever ask yourself in your faith. Have I truly submitted to the authority of Christ in all areas of my life? Because if I haven't, then I'm only fooling myself. I mentioned it this morning in Sunday school. Jesus Christ himself asked, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do the things that I say? In other words, you're only fooling yourself if you choose to live life that way. If you would stand with us, our closing hymn this morning will be number 328.